Eleanor Bishop did not weep. She did not turn her face to the wall. She did not draw the counterpane up to cover the arm the candlelight had just found. She sat very still on the edge of the bed that was now, by law and by ledger, half hers, and she watched her husband of 6 hours look at the ruined skin along her shoulder and down the inside of her arm, the way a man looks at a debt he had not expected to find written into the contract. Her hand came up, not to hide herself, but to close around the small locket at her throat, its silver chain scorched dark on one link where a fire 5 years gone had reached and not quite finished its work. She pressed it flat against her collarbone, the way she always did when a room required her to be steadier than she felt, and she waited. "I did not choose you," Julian Hart, Duke of Winfield, had said not 20 minutes before, in the flat voice he used for accounts. "I collected you. There is a difference, and I should like you to understand it before we go further." He understood it very well himself. What he did not yet understand, what he would not understand for the better part of a year, though the proof of it was sitting 3 feet away from him, with her chin level, and her breath even, was that a woman could be collected like a debt, and still not be spent like one. By the time the leaves turned again in Winshire, the Duke who had married her to balance an old account would find himself the one in arrears, and there would not be a ledger in England long enough to hold what he owed. The spring of 1817 had come to the county the way it always did, thin and grey, and smelling of wet chalk. And nobody within 20 miles of Ashcombe had expected a bishop daughter to marry a duke at all, let alone the elder one, the quiet one, the one the village had taken to calling. Not unkindly, but not kindly either, the burned Miss Bishop. She had been 19 when the fire took her mother, and half the skin of her left arm and shoulder. She was 24 now, and in 5 years she had made herself so useful to her father's household, his accounts balanced, his creditors managed, his tenants' rents recorded in a hand steadier than his own, that nobody thought to ask whether she wanted a life beyond the small, exact, invisible one she had built for herself out of columns and totals. Baron Simon Bishop owed £14,000 by the spring of 1817, the wreckage of a shipping venture he had entered against the advice of every sensible man he knew, and he owed it to men who did not care that he had once, many years before, done something far worse than lose money carelessly. He had done it quietly, and he had done it well, and for 15 years no one had proven otherwise. He did not think of that debt often. He thought of the £14,000 nearly every waking hour, and so when the Duke of Winfield's solicitor called at Ashcombe Hall with an offer that would clear every farthing of it in exchange for the Baron's elder daughter's hand, Simon Bishop said yes before the solicitor had finished the sentence. He did not ask his daughter. He informed her, over breakfast, between the marmalade and the second cup of tea, in the tone he used for weather. Eleanor set down her spoon with both hands, deliberately, the way she had learned to set things down since the fire. Nothing sudden, nothing that might be mistaken for a flinch. And she asked only one question, which was whether the £14,000 would in fact clear the debt in full, because she had seen her father's books, and she did not trust his arithmetic. Her father had not liked the question. He had answered it anyway, because in 5 years he had learned that his daughter's arithmetic was never wrong. She did not know, that morning, why a duke she had never met would pay so extravagant a price for a wife nobody wanted. She would learn later, from a groundskeeper with a bad hip and a long memory, from a solicitor who kept old papers the way other men kept old grudges, that the Duke of Winfield had spent 9 years rebuilding an estate that her own father had helped to ruin, and that he had been waiting, with the patience of a man who has nothing left but patience, for a way into the Bishop household that no lawyer could keep him out of. A marriage settlement opened doors that no writ ever could. He had not wanted a wife, he had wanted an entrance. She was not told this. She was told only that the wedding would be in a fortnight, at Winfield's own chapel rather than the county church, which her father called an honour, and Eleanor privately understood to mean the Duke did not wish to give the county gossips a public performance of the transaction before he had finished arranging its terms. She packed her own trunk. She packed the account books she had kept for her father, out of habit more than anything, and the small locket that had belonged to her mother, its chain scorched on one link from the night she had put it around her own neck before going back into the smoke a second time for her brother, and a third time for her sister, and had not gone back a fourth time only because there had been no one left inside to go back for. Her sister Alice was 10 now, and did not remember their mother's face except from the little painted portrait inside that locket. Her brother Thomas was 16, and remembered everything, which was worse. Eleanor had raised them both in the 5 years since, in the gaps between her father's debts and her father's absences. And she had promised herself certain things in that time, that she would allow herself grief only in measured amounts, 10 minutes by the mantel clock and no longer, and then she would work, because grief unmetered was a debt that never stopped accruing interest. She kept a column in her mind, the way she kept one in the ledgers, for things she would not add up yet. It was, she had found, the only way to stay solvent. On the morning of the wedding her father wept with relief and called it joy. Eleanor wore her mother's locket beneath a high collar of Belgian lace that hid nothing so much as it drew the eye toward what it did not hide, and she stood in the small chapel at Winfield Park, and married a man whose face she had seen for the first time only 4 days before, across a receiving room, when he had looked at her exactly once, assessed her exactly once, and then spoken to her father about tenant rolls for the better part of an hour, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been satisfactorily delivered. She did not love him. She did not expect to be loved by him. What she had not expected, walking into Winfield Park that evening with her trunk and her locket and her 5 years of careful arithmetic, was that before the candles in her new bedchamber had burned an inch, her husband would learn something about her that her own father, in 5 years of living under the same roof, had never once troubled himself to ask. The door of the bedchamber closed. The bolt did not turn. Julian Hart never touched a bolt in his own house, out of some old unexamined superstition he would not have named even to himself, and the fire in the grate settled with a small collapsing sound, and Eleanor Bishop, now Eleanor Hart, Duchess of Winfield by an hour and a half, began, without being asked, and without being ashamed, to unfasten the long row of buttons at her wrist. The Duke had married her to settle an old and private account, and he had told himself, in the weeks of arranging it, that whatever else she was, she would be simple, a grateful bride, plain and biddable, glad of rescue, unlikely to complicate a transaction he had spent 9 years constructing with the patience of a man rebuilding a house 1 stone at a time. He had not accounted for complication. He accounted for it now, in the candlelight, watching his wife's hands work steadily down a row of buttons, with no more visible feeling than if she were closing a ledger for the night, and he found that the words he had prepared, the flat, correct, transactional words he had rehearsed on the ride from the chapel, had gone somewhere he could not immediately locate. "You need not undress for my benefit tonight," he said, because it was the nearest true thing he could find. "I did not marry you for that. I know precisely what you married me for," Eleanor said. You made that admirably clear at supper, in front of your own butler, in language I imagine you have used before to describe a promissory note." She did not look up from the buttons. "I am not undressing for your benefit. I am undressing because I have worn this collar since 8 this morning, and it itches abominably, and because I have found that people manage their surprise better when I do not make a performance of concealment. You will have your surprise, either way, sir. I would rather have it now. By candlelight, standing, than later, by accident, in a manner that unsettles us both." He did not understand her yet. He understood her a great deal better 4 minutes later, when the collar came away and the candle threw its light along the ruined geography of her left shoulder and down the inside of her arm, old burns, healed years since, into a landscape of pale, taut, permanently altered skin, the kind a surgeon might call remarkable, and a drawing-room would call unspeakable, and his wife stood before him without a single tremor in her hands, waiting for whatever verdict he intended to pass, as though verdicts were a weather she had long since stopped dressing against. He did not step back. He did not step forward either. He stood very still, the way a man stands when he is doing arithmetic he dislikes, and something behind his eyes moved that he would not have been able to name if asked. "How?" he said, and stopped. Started again. "How did this happen to you?" "I do not discuss it as an opening kindness," Eleanor said. "I have found it invites either pity or theatre, and I have no use for either. I will tell you the plain facts once, and then we need not revisit them unless you wish to." She folded the collar over her arm, an ordinary domestic gesture that made the moment stranger rather than smaller. "There was a fire at my father's house in town 5 years ago this coming autumn. My mother did not come out of it. My brother and my sister did, because I went back for them. This," she indicated her shoulder without drama, the way she might indicate a column total, "is the receipt." Julian Hart said nothing for the length of several breaths. It was, for a man who had built 9 years of careful revenge on the premise that the Bishop family owed him a reckoning, an unfamiliar silence. Not the silence of calculation, which he knew intimately, but something with no ledger line to hold it. "I did not know that," he said finally. "No," Eleanor agreed. "You knew what my father owed you. You did not trouble yourself to learn what it had cost the rest of us to live under his roof while he owed it." She said this without heat, the way she might correct a sum. "You were not obliged to find that interesting, Your Grace, but you did ask, and I do not care to be married to a man who asks questions and then flinches from the answers. I did not flinch." "No," she said, and for the first time something almost like amusement crossed her face, gone as quickly as it came. "You didn't. I will grant you that much on our wedding night, if nothing else." He left the room within the half-hour, on the grounds, stated with perfect courtesy and no warmth whatsoever, that she must be tired from the journey and the ceremony, and that Winfield kept separate chambers for good reason. Eleanor watched the door close behind him, and sat for exactly 10 minutes by the little clock on the mantel, her hand around the scorched locket, doing the accounting she permitted herself and no more. Then she rose, unpacked her own trunk without ringing for a maid, set her father's, her own now, she supposed, account books on the writing desk in a neat stack, and went to bed in a house that did not yet know what to do with her. She met Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper, before breakfast, a broad grey woman, with a face that had clearly decided long ago that most things in life were either useful or they were not, and precious little in between. Mrs. Prentice looked at the new Duchess for a long moment, at the high-collared morning gown, at the steady hands, at the ledger tucked under one arm as though it were a prayer book, and said only, "You'll be wanting the estate books then, not the household ones." His Grace has let both go to seed this 12-month past, being occupied elsewhere. It was not quite a welcome. It was, Eleanor understood, an offer of alliance, and she took it the only way she knew how, which was by asking, before the tea had even been poured, exactly how far in seed the books had gone. The estate books had gone, as it turned out, considerably further than the Duke himself knew, and Eleanor Hart discovered this not through confrontation, but the way she discovered most things, quietly, with a pencil, before anyone else in the house was awake. Miss Doyle, the estate steward, was an honest man drowning politely in work he had never been trained to do alone. He had managed Winfield's day accounts since the old Duke's time, and the tenant rolls since the new ones, and he had never in 9 years had a second pair of competent eyes to check his sums against, because the Duke himself was occupied with matters he discussed with no one, old debts, old names, old grievances, kept in a locked drawer of his study that Doyle had learned not to ask about. When the new Duchess appeared in the estate office on her 3rd morning at Winfield, in a plain grey gown with ink already on 2 fingers, and asked to see the rent ledger for the Northern Farms, Doyle very nearly refused her out of sheer surprise before deciding that a duchess who arrived before he did was not a duchess to be trifled with. Within the week she had found what 9 years of Doyle's honest, overburdened arithmetic had not caught. 3 tenant families on the northern boundary paying rents calculated against an old, outdated acreage survey, overcharged by a cumulative £11 a quarter, for want of anyone updating the figures after a boundary dispute, had quietly shrunk their holdings. It was not theft. It was neglect wearing theft's coat, which in Eleanor's experience was very often the same garment. She corrected the figures, drafted the adjustment letters herself, and had Doyle present them to the tenants as the estate's own initiative rather than her discovery, because she had learned early that credit mattered a great deal less than the correction, and that a steward who felt useful worked harder than one who felt exposed. "You might have brought this to me first," Julian said, when he found the adjusted ledger on his study desk with her small, exact hand in the margins. "I might have," Eleanor agreed. "But you were in London for the fortnight, and Mrs. Ellery of the North Farm was 3 weeks from selling her only cow to make good a debt she did not in fact owe. I judged the cow could not wait for your convenience." He looked at her for a long moment across the desk, the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to be offended, and finding, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was not. "You corrected 9 years of my steward's arithmetic in a week. I corrected 3 lines of it. Mr. Doyle is not incompetent, Your Grace. He is simply one man doing the work of 2, and has been for some time, and nobody thought to mention it to you because you have not, I think, asked anyone at Winfield how they truly fare in some years." She said it without accusation, the way she said most difficult things, as a fact laid flat upon a table rather than a blade drawn. "I do not say this to wound you. I say it because it is useful information, and you married me, by your own account, for utility." He did not answer that directly, but 2 days later Doyle received, without explanation, a note from the Duke's own hand authorising the hiring of a junior clerk, and Eleanor, reading the estate correspondence as she now did every morning, understood this for what it was, not an apology which the Duke was not yet capable of, but the first small evidence that he had heard her. The almost smile came in October, over a dispute about drainage on the eastern fields that Eleanor solved with a borrowed surveyor's chain and a morning's walking that left the hem of her second-best gown ruined past saving. She reported the solution at supper with the flat satisfaction of a woman closing a difficult account, and Julian Hart, listening, felt the corner of his mouth move in a way it had not moved in longer than he cared to calculate, and covered it, from long habit, by lifting his glass. Eleanor saw it anyway. She said nothing. She only marked it, filed it, the way she filed most things now, in the column she was not yet totalling, and went on describing the drainage. It was around this time that the county began, cautiously and then less cautiously, to speak of the new Duchess of Winfield in a different register than it had spoken of the burned Miss Bishop. Gossip in Winshire moved the way water moved downhill, finding every crack, pooling in every hollow, and by late October it had found its way from the tenant farms to the drawing rooms of Faircross, carrying word of overcharged rents quietly and generously corrected, of a duchess who walked her own fields in ruined hems rather than sending a man to do it for her. Lady Cathcart, who had once called Eleanor the poor scarred bishop girl, so unfortunate, so unsuited to society, was heard by no fewer than 3 witnesses at the autumn assembly, describing her instead as remarkably capable, my dear, quite remarkably capable, which in the private language of county society was as close to an apology as that particular lady had ever issued to anyone. It was also around this time that Julian Hart, without entirely intending to, began telling his wife things he had not told anyone in 9 years. It happened first by accident, over the estate's oldest maps, which Eleanor had asked to see in order to understand the original boundaries before the survey dispute. Among them was a smaller, separate paper, older and more careworn than the rest. A partial account in a hand she did not recognise, describing repairs to a mill wheel that no longer existed on any current map of Winfield. The mill burned. No, Julian stopped himself, the correction visible on his face before he made it. The mill did not burn. It failed. The wheel housing rotted through in a wet winter because the repair funds that ought to have gone to it went elsewhere. And by the time anyone discovered where, 40 families who depended on that mill for their livelihood had nowhere to take their grain, and my father, who was already unwell, spent 3 weeks in the rain trying to salvage what could be salvaged, and caught a fever from it that he never fully threw off. He died 8 months later. I was 19. Where did the funds go? Eleanor asked, very quietly, though something cold had already begun moving through her, the particular stillness of a person doing arithmetic she very much did not wish to complete. Into a shipping venture, Julian said, authorised by signature I have never been able to prove was forged, though I have believed it for 9 years. Entered by the man who held trusteeship of my father's estate during his illness. Your father, Eleanor, Simon Bishop. The room was very quiet. Eleanor did not gasp. She did not reach for the locket at her throat, though her hand wanted to. She sat with the old repair account in her hands, and read it again, slowly, and when she spoke her voice was as level as it had been on her wedding night. That is why you married me. That is why I married you, Julian said. I wanted a door into your father's papers that no court could deny me. I did not expect. He stopped again. Started again, the sentence costing him visibly more than the last. I did not expect to find, on the other side of that door, someone who had spent 5 years cleaning up the wreckage of a house I had assumed was entirely his. No, Eleanor said. I don't imagine you did. She set the mill account down on the desk between them, very carefully, the way she set down most things that mattered. "I will help you find your proof, Julian, not because you married me for it. Because if my father did this, and I confess I have wondered in a quiet corner of my mind for longer than I care to admit, then he did it to 40 families who never harmed him, and to a boy of 19 who lost his father for it, and that is not a debt that should go on sitting unpaid, simply because it has sat unpaid for 9 years already. It was the first time either of them had said the word father in that room, without flinching from what it might mean, and it was also, though neither of them named it that night, the moment the marriage stopped being only a transaction, and became, however cautiously, a shared account. The proof, when it came, did not come from where either of them expected. It came from Reginald Hart, the Duke's cousin, and, in the absence of an heir of Julian's own body, the man who stood to inherit Winfield entire should anything happen to remove Julian first. Reginald had attended the wedding with a smile so warm the county called him gracious, and he had spent the months since paying the new Duchess exactly the degree of courteous attention a man pays a woman he does not consider an obstacle worth the effort of disliking openly. He had also, though nobody at Winfield yet knew it, spent 9 years in quiet possession of a letter that would have ended his cousin's search for proof in an afternoon. A letter in Simon Bishop's own hand, addressed to his solicitor, admitting the diversion of the mill funds in language too plain to survive a magistrate's reading, and he had kept it not out of loyalty to anyone, but because a frightened baron paying regular, discreet sums to keep an old letter from a duke's hands was worth a great deal more to Reginald Hart than the letter's exposure ever could be. The marriage had frightened him from the first. A duke's solicitor auditing a father-in-law's papers was a very different animal from a duke's private suspicion, and Reginald had watched, with mounting unease, as the new Duchess proved herself exactly the sort of methodical, unhurried, unfrightenable woman who would eventually turn her attention to precisely the papers he had spent 9 years keeping buried. By November he had decided that the marriage itself would have to be discredited before the papers were. He found Eleanor in the small library on a grey afternoon, going through a box of old correspondence Doyle had unearthed from the muniment room, and he was, as always, warm. "You work a great deal. For a duchess," he said, settling into the chair opposite without being asked. "One might almost think you were still keeping your father's books." "One might," Eleanor agreed, not looking up. "It is a habit I have found difficult to break, given how useful it has proven." Useful. Reginald turned the word over as though tasting it. "It is a word my cousin uses a great deal, when he speaks of you. I confess I have wondered whether you find it comfortable, being useful. Some women prefer to be adored." "Some women have the luxury of choosing between the two," Eleanor said. "I have generally found that the ones who insist loudest on being adored are rarely useful to anyone, including themselves. I do not say that as a criticism of adoration, Mr. Hart only, as an observation about arithmetic." She looked up at him then, for the first time, with an expression of perfectly courteous attention that gave him nothing at all to work with. "Was there something in particular you wished to discuss?" He had wished, in fact, to discuss a great many things, none of which he raised that afternoon, and all of which surfaced within the fortnight in the form of a signed affidavit that reached the county magistrate, and copies of which reached, by means Reginald was careful never to be traced to, 3 of the most reliably talkative households in Faircross. The affidavit was sworn by a former bishop housemaid, well paid and long removed from the county, and it stated that the fire 5 years before had not been an accident at all, that the elder Miss Bishop had been seen, before the blaze began, behaving strangely near the nursery grate, and at her subsequent burns. Far from being the mark of a rescue, were the mark of a girl who had misjudged her own device and been caught by it. It was, as pieces of paper went, a masterwork of plausible cruelty, built to attach itself precisely to the wound Eleanor had already survived once and could least easily disprove, since the only witnesses to the true events of that night were a dead mother and 2 children who had been, respectively, 11 and 5 years old at the time. Eleanor read the affidavit standing in the Winfield entrance hall, having been handed it by a white-faced Doyle, who had intercepted it before it reached her husband, and she read it twice. She did not cry. She did not crumple it. She folded it once, along its existing crease, and set it on the hall table with both hands, the way she had once set down a teacup on the worst night of her life, and she said, to no one in particular, "Well, that did not take him as long as I expected." "Your Grace," Doyle began. "I am quite well, Mr. Doyle," Eleanor said, and the fact that she had to say it aloud was, to anyone who knew her, the only visible crack in an otherwise unbroken surface. "I find I am not even especially surprised. A man who will sit on evidence of one crime for 9 years for profit is not likely to hesitate over inventing a second one for the same purpose." She looked at the folded paper for a moment longer. "Send word to Dr. Alcott in Faircross. He treated my burns himself 5 years ago, and made careful notes at the time, being a careful man. And send for my brother. Thomas is 16 now, old enough to be believed, and he was in that nursery, Miss Doyle. He knows exactly what his sister did and did not do on the worst night of both their lives. She did not tell Julian that evening, not out of concealment, but because she had learned, in her father's house, that information delivered in a panic was information poorly used, and she preferred to bring him the affidavit alongside the beginnings of its answer rather than the wound alone. When she finally laid both before him, the folded paper and, beside it, a note in her own hand outlining exactly whom she intended to summon and why, he read the affidavit once, went very still in the particular way she had come to recognise as his version of fury held on a short lead, and then read her note, and something in his shoulders eased fractionally at finding, before he had even had the chance to be useful to her, that she had already begun to be useful to herself. "I will find the man who paid for this," he said. "I expect you already suspect who," Eleanor said. "I do not ask you to confirm it aloud tonight. I ask only that when the time comes to prove it, you let me help you build the case rather than simply avenging it. A ruined man makes a poor witness, Julian, a cornered one, properly cornered, on the other hand, tends to talk." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are remarkably calm for a woman who has just been accused, in writing, of setting the fire that killed her own mother." "I am not calm," Eleanor said. "I am working. There is a difference, and I have found over 5 years that the second is a great deal more useful than the first, and considerably harder to take from me." The gathering Julian called at Winfield Park in the second week of December was announced to the county as an accounting. The new Duke and Duchess, it was said, wished to present the estate's tenants and neighbours with an open ledger, a transparent settlement of the boundary disputes and rent corrections that had occupied the household since summer, in the spirit of the new year. It was, on its face, precisely the sort of dry, sensible occasion that would have emptied a lesser house of half its guests. Every family within 20 miles attended anyway, because the county had learned by December that wherever the new Duchess of Winfield produced a ledger, something worth watching generally followed. Reginald Hart attended as well, seated near the front with the particular ease of a man who believes himself, for once, to be holding the stronger hand. He had heard, through channels he trusted, that Baron Bishop was present under duress and thoroughly frightened, and he had concluded, not unreasonably, that a frightened bishop was a bishop who might yet be persuaded to attack his own daughter's credibility before anyone attacked his. Eleanor stood at the long table at the front of the assembly hall, with 3 ledgers before her, a stack of correspondence beside them, and no notes in her hand, because she had long since stopped needing notes for numbers she had carried in her head for weeks. She began, as she had told Julian she would, with the ordinary business, the corrected rents, the drainage settlement, the new terms Doyle's junior clerk had helped to draft for the northern farms, and the room settled into the comfortable rhythm of a duchess, doing precisely what she had built a reputation for doing. Then she set down her pen, and the room's rhythm changed with it. "Some of you," she said, "will have seen or heard tell of a sworn statement circulated this fortnight past concerning the fire that took my mother's life 5 years ago. I do not intend to leave that statement unanswered in whispers when it was delivered to this county in ink." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room had already gone very still. The particular stillness of a crowd that senses it is about to be given something true. "Dr. Alcott of Faircross treated my injuries the night of that fire, within the hour, and kept notes at the time, being a careful man in a trade that requires it. Dr. Alcott, will you tell the room what those notes record?" The physician rose from his seat near the wall, an old man, dry and precise, exactly the sort of witness a magistrate trusted on sight, and described, in the flat clinical language of his profession, burns consistent with a person moving toward danger, arms extended, palms and forearms taking the worst of it. The unmistakable pattern, he said, of someone reaching into fire rather than recoiling from it. "I have seen a great many burns in 40 years of practice," he finished. "I have never once seen that pattern on a person who set the blaze themselves. It does not occur that way. The body does not lie about which direction it was moving." Thomas Bishop, 16 and visibly unused to standing before a room of his betters, spoke next, in a voice that shook only slightly and steadied as he went on, describing a night he had never before been asked to describe aloud, his sister's hands closing around his arm in the smoke, her voice telling him to keep low. The second time she went back for their sister, when every grown person in the house was too occupied or too frightened to go. "She did not start that fire," he said. "I have known for 5 years who did start it, because our housekeeper told me once, before she left our service rather suddenly. It was a coal spilled from the nursery grate that nobody banked properly that night, and the housemaid who has now sworn otherwise for money is the very woman who was meant to bank it and did not, and has had every reason these 5 years to wish nobody asked her about it directly. It was at this point that Baron Simon Bishop, 3 rows back, made the sound of a man whose careful architecture of avoidance has just been struck by something he cannot deflect. And it was at this point, too, that Mr. Fenwick, the county solicitor who had served the Winfield estate since the old Duke's day, and who had been asked by Eleanor, quietly, a fortnight before, to review certain papers in his keeping, rose and asked to be heard. "I have in my possession," Fenwick said, "papers held in trust since the death of the late Duke, sealed at his own instruction, to be opened only should his son find sufficient cause. I opened them a fortnight ago, at the current Duchess's request, having satisfied myself that cause existed." He held up a slim folio. "They include the original repair authorization for the Winfield mill, bearing a signature purporting to be the late Duke's own, made while he lay unwell and unable to write more than his initials, a fact attested at the time by his physician, whose notes I also hold. The signature on this authorization does not match his hand in a single particular. It matches, however, a hand this county knows well, having seen it on a dozen parish documents over the years belonging to the trustee who managed the late Duke's affairs during his illness. Baron Simon Bishop. The room's turning was not sudden. It moved the way a tide moves, a long, slow reversal felt before it was seen, a shifting of bodies in seats, a murmur that built without ever quite becoming noise, gentry and tenants alike recalculating, in real time, 5 years of assumptions about which Bishop Daughter had been the family's disgrace. It was Tam Wicks, the old mill foreman, gone grey and slow in the years since the wheel housing rotted through, who delivered the final weight of it, rising unbidden from a bench near the back where he had come, he said afterward, only to see the young Duke's wife who'd fixed the northern rents fairly, and finding himself with something to say after all. I begged for those repair funds myself 3 times before the wheel gave, he said, his voice carrying without effort in a room that had gone silent to hear it. I was told they'd gone to the estate's other needs. I never learned what needs those were till this very hour. 40 families went hungry that winter for it, and the old Duke caught his death trying to mend with his own 2 hands what money would have mended in a week. He looked, not at Eleanor, but at her father, 3 rows away, with the plain, unhurried contempt of a working man who has waited a long time to say a true thing to a powerful one. I'd like to know, my lord, what needs those were. Reginald Hart, watching the room's attention swing towards Simon Bishop, understood with the particular cold clarity of a gambler seeing his hand cooled that his own position had gone, in the space of 10 minutes, from advantageous to catastrophic, and he made the single worst decision of the afternoon, which was to attempt to leave before anyone thought to stop him. Mr. Hart, Eleanor said, and her voice, pitched exactly as it had been for the ledgers, stopped him at the door more effectively than a raised one could have. Before you go, I wonder if you would help me account for something. Among my father's private papers, which he was persuaded, this very morning, to allow reviewed given the gravity of what stood to be proven here today, there are 11 letters spanning 9 years, unsigned, demanding sums of money in exchange for silence regarding a certain forged authorization. The hand is disguised in the letters themselves, badly, by someone more confident of his cleverness than his skill. But the direction on the earliest of them, sent before the sender learned better caution, was not disguised at all. She held up a single folded sheet. It is your hand, Mr. Hart. I have had a fortnight to compare it against a dozen notes you have written me yourself, on subjects considerably less costly. Reginald Hart did not run. There was, in truth, nowhere in that room to run to. He stood very still at the door, and something behind his composure, some machinery he had relied on for 9 years, visibly went out, the way a candle goes out when the wax finally gives way beneath it, and the silence that followed was the silence of a county watching a clever man discover, all at once, that cleverness had never been the same thing as safety. Simon Bishop wept, at the end, in front of the whole assembly, and it was not performance. Eleanor could tell the difference by now, better than most. He did not ask for mercy in words. He simply sat, undone. A man who had spent 15 years building a life on a debt he had told himself he would never have to pay, discovering all at once that the payment had come due in his own daughter's steady hands. I could have you prosecuted, Eleanor said to him quietly, in the hush that followed. the whole room straining to hear a conversation she made no effort to hide. "Mr. Fenwick assures me the papers would support it. I could see you ruined entirely, father, and there are people in this room tonight who would consider it no more than justice." She let that sit for a moment, watching him absorb it. "I am not going to do that. Not because you have earned mercy. You have not. And I will not insult either of us by pretending otherwise. I am going to require restitution instead. Every family owed money from that mill's failure will be repaid, in full, from what remains of your estate, under Mr. Fenwick's supervision, before a single further shilling is spent on anything else. You will not be prosecuted, and you will not be forgiven either. Those are different accounts, and I do not intend to let you confuse them again. It was, the county agreed afterward, the single most talked of afternoon in Windsor in a generation, and it was talked of for years less for the villain undone at the door than for the sight of a duchess dispensing a sentence of mercy in a voice that never once rose, with a room full of witnesses who had, not 6 months before, called her the burned Miss Bishop, and thought that the whole of what she was. Julian found her afterward, alone in the small library where she had once been handed the affidavit that started the whole reckoning, sitting with her hands folded and her face, for the first time in his experience of her, entirely without its careful composure. "You did not tell me you meant to summon Fenwick's papers before today," he said. "You did not tell me about Alcott, or your brother, or the letters. I found out with the rest of the room." "I know," Eleanor said. "I am sorry for that part. Not for the doing of it. I would do it again exactly as I did. But I should have told you, and I did not. Because some part of me was still braced for you to want it stopped, or slowed, or handled the way a duke handles things rather than the way I handle things." She looked up at him. "That is not fair to you. You have given me no cause these past months to expect that of you. I would like to apologize for it properly, if you will let me." "I will let you," Julian said, "on the condition that you let me do the same. I owe you a great deal more than an apology for one afternoon's silence, Eleanor. I owe you an explanation, in full, of everything I did not tell you when I married you, and I find I have been putting it off, because it costs me more than I expected to say it aloud." "An apology and an explanation are not the same thing," Eleanor said. "I have found men very willing to offer the first while withholding the second, as though sorrow alone settles an account. It does not. I should like both from you, in full, whenever you are ready to give them." He gave them that night, in the library, with the fire burned low, and no one to overhear but the two of them. He told her everything. The 9 years of quiet investigation, the letters he had never been able to trace, the moment his solicitor had first suggested marriage into the Bishop family as a door no writ could close, and the cold, careful calculation that had followed, in which he had told himself, over and over, that the woman on the other side of that door was simply a means, and that he need feel nothing for a means beyond the ordinary courtesy owed to any instrument that served him well. "I stopped believing that within a month," he said. "I did not tell you, because admitting it meant admitting the whole foundation of the marriage was rotten, and I did not know how to rebuild on rotten foundations without first tearing down everything I had built the marriage to achieve. I am not skilled at this, Eleanor. I have spent 9 years being skilled at revenge. I find I have almost no practice at all being skilled at the other thing." "Then we are evenly matched," Eleanor said, "because I have spent 5 years being skilled at survival, and almost none at all at the other thing either." She was quiet a moment. "I do not require you to have loved me from the first, Julian. I would find it frankly suspicious if you claimed you had. What I require, if we are to make something real of what began as a transaction, is this: my authority over this household's accounts remains mine, not as a courtesy you extend, but as a right you do not revisit each time it suits you to revisit it. The tenants' wages, corrected this year, remain corrected formally in writing, regardless of what any future steward might prefer. My name is used, in full, on documents that concern this estate, not folded quietly into yours. And when you are wrong, because you will be, as I will be, being neither of us made of better material than the rest of the world, I require you to say so in words, not merely in the absence of argument. "All right," Julian said. "All right, then," Eleanor said. "That is the whole of it. It is not a long list." "It is not," he agreed. "I find I would have given you a longer one, had you asked, and been glad to." Her father came to Winfield once more before Christmas, at Eleanor's invitation rather than his own asking, and delivered the one apology of the whole affair that she required in person rather than by restitution. He did not dress it in excuses. He said, standing in the same small library, that he had treated her competence as a convenience and her scars as an embarrassment for 5 years, because it had been easier than admitting what her steadiness had cost her, and that he was sorry, not for being caught, but for the 15 years before that, when he might have been a different sort of father and had chosen, every single day, not to be. Eleanor listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and when he finished she said only, "Thank you for saying it plainly. I do not know yet whether I forgive you. I know that I am glad, at last, to have heard it," which was, everyone who witnessed the exchange agreed, exactly as much honesty as the moment could bear, and not one word more. The ordinary days that followed were, Eleanor found, harder to describe than any of the extraordinary ones had been, and dearer for it. There was the morning in January when Julian moved his chair in the estate office from across the desk to beside it, without comment, and simply began reading the tenant ledger over her shoulder, as though he had always sat there. There was the afternoon he poured her tea before she asked for it, having learned, apparently without being told, that she took it with too little sugar and too much patience for anyone to trouble mentioning otherwise. There was the evening he brought her the estate's oldest map, the one with the vanished mill upon it, and asked, hesitantly, whether she would help him decide where a new one might be built, since half the county's grain still travelled 11 miles to be ground for want of it. None of it, alone, would have made a story worth telling. Together, it was the only story that mattered. The relapse came in February, small and almost forgivable, the way old habits always are. A tenant dispute arose over a boundary hedge, and Julian, out of 9 years' habit of deciding things alone and announcing them afterward, settled it himself over a single afternoon and informed Eleanor of the outcome at supper as a fact already closed. "You did that without me," she said, not with anger, but with the flat clarity of a woman naming a pattern rather than a single offence. "Not because the matter was urgent. Doyle tells me it had waited a fortnight already, and could have waited 1 evening more, but because it was easier to decide alone than to decide together, and old habits are easier than new ones. I understand the impulse, Julian. I ask you to notice it in yourself, the way I try to notice mine." He was silent a moment, and she watched him do the work of hearing it rather than defending against it, which she had come to recognise as the truest measure of the man he was becoming. "You are right," he said finally. "I will send word to the Ellery family that the settlement is not yet final, and we will decide it together tomorrow as we agreed." He paused. "I am sorry, not for the decision, which was fair enough on its own merits, for deciding it as though you were not standing beside me, capable of deciding it too." "That," Eleanor said, "is precisely the difference between an explanation and an apology. Thank you for giving me both. It was on an ordinary evening not long after, with no occasion to mark it beyond the simple fact of two people sitting by a fire that no longer felt like a room holding its breath, that Julian said the thing he had been circling for months without quite reaching it. I told you once that I did not choose you, that I collected you, the way a man collects a debt owed him. He turned the small scorched locket over in his fingers. She had given it into his keeping that autumn, the first time she had trusted anyone with it since her mother died. And he had had the melted clasp quietly repaired by a jeweller in Faircross without ever mentioning it, so that when he pressed it back into her palm now, it closed, for the first time in 5 years, without catching. I was wrong about the word, if nothing else. I did not choose you first, Eleanor. I chose the transaction, and you came attached to it, and I told myself that was the whole of the matter. But I have been choosing you every day since. In every small ordinary way, a man has to choose a thing he has decided he cannot do without. That is not collection. I would beg you to believe there is no ledger for it at all. I would choose you too, Eleanor said. And I have been choosing you for some time now, though I confess I did not always say so aloud, being a woman who prefers her accounts settled quietly. She closed her hand around the locket, warm now instead of cold, whole now instead of scarred at its edge. I do not require you to have loved me from the beginning, Julian. I require only that you go on choosing it the way you have these past months, for as long as we both have days left to spend on it. Then we are agreed, he said. We are agreed, she answered, and it was as such things had been all along in that particular household, the whole of the treaty, sealed in 4 words, and a hand that no longer needed to be steadied for anyone's benefit but her own. 2 years passed, as years do, in the particular unhurried accumulation of a life well kept. The new mill rose on the old foundations by the second spring, its opening marked not with a ceremony for the county's gentry, but with a fair wage board nailed beside its door, listing every rate paid to every family who worked it, in Eleanor's own steady hand, because she had learned that transparency, once written down, was very hard for anyone to quietly unwrite again. A small school opened in Thorn Green the autumn after that, built at the Duchess's particular insistence for the children of tenant families who had never before had letters taught to them for free. And Tam Wicks, too old now for the mill floor, could be found there most mornings teaching sums to children who called him, without any of them quite knowing why, the man who had told the truth that day at the great house. Baron Simon Bishop lived out his remaining years in a smaller house on a smaller income, his debts repaid to the last family they had wronged, visited twice yearly by grandchildren who knew him as a quiet, chastened old man rather than the father Eleanor remembered, which was, she had come to think, its own kind of justice, neither cruel nor soft, simply accurate. Reginald Hart left the county entirely, and was not spoken of again above a murmur, his name quietly removed from the succession, his 9 years of careful cleverness worth, in the end exactly nothing at all. Eleanor wore her mother's locket openly now, above her collar rather than beneath it, its mended clasp catching the light at county assemblies, where she no longer wore high lace to hide anything, because she had stopped, somewhere in those 2 years, needing to. The scars along her arm and shoulder were still there, would always be there. And she had come to think of them not as a wound to be concealed, but as a ledger entry, honestly kept, of a night she had survived and a family she had saved. And she found she did not mind at all when a curious child at the new school once asked her, plainly, what had happened to her arm. And she told the truth plainly. And the child nodded and went back to his sums as though nothing remarkable had been said at all, because to him, by then, nothing had. Winfield Park itself had changed in ways harder to put in any ledger. The house that had held its breath for 9 years, through a father's death, a son's cold arithmetic of revenge, a marriage built on a debt rather than a wish, had, by the second spring, begun to exhale, in ordinary, unremarkable ways, a child's laughter somewhere down a corridor by the 3rd year, a chair permanently moved beside a desk that had once sat empty across from it, a fire kept lit in a library where 2 people had once traded an apology for an explanation, and found, in the trading, something neither of them had thought to look for. She had not asked, at 19, to be seen. She had not asked, at 24, standing in candlelight with her collar undone, to be anything other than exactly what she was. She had simply refused, over and over, in ledgers and letters, and quiet unhurried mornings, to be made smaller than the truth of herself, and in refusing, without ever once raising her voice to do it, she had made herself impossible to overlook, impossible to devalue, impossible, in the end, to unsee. That was not a thing any man could collect from her. It was not a debt, and it had never been for sale. It was simply, at last, and for good, hers,